Okay, so our next speaker is Danny Cole from Newcastle University, who will speak about bespoke interaction potentials for computer-aided drug design.
Great. Thank you very much, Zoe. And thank you for the organizers for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit of work we've been doing over the last few years in force fields, particularly focused at computer-aided drug design applications, as we've heard in the rest of this session as well. So fortunately, I don't need to motivate now how important free energy calculations are for drug discovery type applications. And as we've also heard, these are really nice methods because they're very rigorous and really only the accuracy is really determined by both the sampling and the force fields, which I'll talk about here. So just to get everyone on the same page, when I'm talking about force fields in this talk, I'm mostly talking about force fields of this form where we have these bonded interactions for covalently bonded atoms and a sort of electrostatic and Leonard-Jones type interaction for the non-bonded part. And that's because these ones are the ones that are dominantly used in free energy calculations. So we want our methods to be used today in these sorts of calculations. But as we've heard already in this session, the problem with these force fields is that they require very, very large parameter libraries. And constructing these is extremely time consuming. Which is limiting new advances in functional form. So the goal in my group is to try to derive bespoke force field parameters directly for the molecule under study. So we don't need to make this transferable parameter assumption. And we're going to get as many of these force field parameters as possible from the atomic environment. Traditionally, we've been getting it from quantum mechanics, but towards the end of my talk, I'll talk about how we're now getting these from machine learning to increase the speed of that parameterization process. So this sort of hierarchy was already described yesterday very nicely in the XFF talk. So I won't go through it again, but just on the top here, we've got all these extremely accurate ab initio and ML type potentials. And at the bottom, we've got this transferable force field. I'd just like to try and insert our method in here in between these two types of potentials. In particular, we've been developing what we call a quantum mechanical bespoke or QB force field. And the idea is that we retain this very, very simple functional form of the force field so that we can very quickly compute free energy calculations, etc. But we derive as many of these parameters of the force field as possible directly from quantum mechanics. Unfortunately, unlike the XFF force field, we are still using an effective force field. So we do have to do some fitting of parameters to experiment. But as I'll show, the number of parameters that we have to fit is extremely, extremely small, about 5 to 7 or so. And yeah, I've covered all that. So first, why should we bother with bespoke force field parameters? So I'll just describe this mini project I've been doing in collaboration with the Open Force Field Initiative, which John introduced. And in particular, we've been developing a bespoke fit package, which is a Python package just for torsion parameter fitting. So as you'd expect, if you do your quantum mechanical torsion scan shown in blue here, if you take a typical transferable force field, this is limited to open force field, other force fields will do the same. In lots of cases, you'll get a very poor overlap between the force field and quantum mechanical description. So we don't do anything too fancy here. We're just fitting torsion parameters to reproduce the quantum mechanical surface, which is not too difficult. And we can, using the open force field infrastructure, we can transfer those directly into free energy calculations and measure what effect they have. So you've seen these plots already today. So on the left-hand side, we're using the base open force field with errors of around 0.7 kcals per mole in this case. And with the bespoke torsion parameters, we don't break things. And in fact, all of the errors come down in this case. And if you're interested, again, this is the TIC2 system, which the previous two speakers also looked at. So we like bespoke force field parameters now. So the natural question is, can we do it for the other terms in the force field? So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is show you how we go about doing that for those non-bonded parameters. And the basis for the approach that we use is atoms in molecule electron density partitioning, which is quite simple. We do a quantum mechanical calculation of the molecule under study, in this case benzene, which gives us the total electron density. We then partition those electrons amongst the different atoms in the system, as shown in colored here. So the green electron density here is on a carbon and the red on a hydrogen. There are lots of different methods for doing that, but we favor the MBIS and DDEC methods. And then from that partitioned electron density, we perform a series of QM to MM mapping operations to generate the force field parameters. So the most simple case is, of course, the atomic charges. You just count how many electrons have been assigned to each atom, and that is your atomic charge. And I'll tell you about these other terms in the coming slides. And just to note that we compute the electron density in an implicit solvent in order to effectively account for induction effects. So this is a non-polarizable force field. So the charge assignment works well if those atomic electron densities were perfectly spherical. However, that's never really the case. So in cases where we do have a large anisotropy, as shown on the oxygen atom here on this molecule, given by the quantum mechanical electrostatic potential in the bottom left here, of course, if you assign a single point charge on the center of the atom, you will get a uniform electrostatic potential around that atom, which is not a good match in this case. But rather than using dipoles, quadrupoles, octopoles, etc., we take a simpler approach of just adding a couple of offsite charges close to the atom under study. In this case, we have these sort of rabbit ears on the oxygen atom to reproduce the areas of negative charge around the oxygen atom in the lone pair positions. And this is simply done by minimizing the difference between the MM electrostatic potential and the quantum mechanical electrostatic potential of the partitioned electron density. So you can see we have a good fit in this case. So that's charges, anisotropy. The last term in the force field is the Leonard-Jones potential. And for those that are familiar with the Kochenko-Scheffler type approaches for estimating C6 parameters for DFT calculations, we take a similar sort of approach for modeling the Leonard-Jones potential. So if you take a look at the sigma parameter, which sort of tells you how big the atom is, then we get this by taking the sort of free atom radius of the atom and rescaling it by the volume of the atom in the molecule. So given on the previous slide, we know all of these atomic electron densities. We just compute the integral, the r cubed moment of that density to get the volume. So that's simple enough for the sigma term, and I won't go through how we get the epsilon mapping parameter, but basically the energy well depth, again, depends on this mapping parameter and the volume of the atom in the molecule. So what does that look like in terms of the force field parameters? So if you look in the bottom right here, I've given the open force field parameters for this nitrogen atom, which are as you might expect. In the QB force field, we again have a negative charge on the nitrogen atom, but that's augmented by a negatively charged virtual site in the lone pair position. And the epsilon parameter is roughly similar. If we take the nitrogen atoms on the left-hand side of the screen, then again, we have a negative charge on this nitrogen atom, and the open force field assigns the same epsilon parameter in the two environments, even though those two nitrogens have different electron densities on them. Again, with QB, we have a charge, we have a virtual site, and we have an epsilon parameter, which now depends on the atomic environment. So if you want to try that out, you can. It's all available in our KubeKit software. It's all fully automated. So molecule comes in the top left, goes through some initial parameter preparation, and we calculate the electron density, do the atoms in molecule analysis, and get all of the non-bonded parameters. I haven't talked about the bonded terms here, but we can get bonded terms from the Hessian matrix and from torsion drives, and we can write those force fields into OpenMM XML files, for example, for all your molecular dynamics needs. However, as we were constructing that force field, I made several choices. For example, I made a choice of what quantum mechanical method to calculate the electron density with. I chose an atoms and molecule partitioning method. I chose to use offsite charges. But it'd be really nice now to test all of these hypotheses. And as we heard about earlier in this session, because we can rapidly generate these force fields, it becomes easy to test these sorts of hypotheses now. Just one more ingredient that we need to optimize all of these QM to MM mapping parameters for each new force field. And we do that very simply using the open force field infrastructure, and in particular, the force balance software for tuning force field parameters against condensed phase properties. This would be a very challenging problem if you had huge force field libraries to tune, but we only have a very, very small number of QM to MM mapping parameters to tune, typically around 5 to 7. So this is very easy to do. So we can now start to test these force field hypotheses. So I've just tested two things here. So firstly, does the accuracy of liquid property prediction depend strongly on the choice of implicit solvent model used in the charge calculation? So remember, these are used to pre-polarize the charges on the molecule. And interestingly, if we look at errors in the density on the left, at the top, and errors in the heats of vaporization of several molecular liquids parameterized with QB, then actually we get a very constant error, which is independent of the choice of implicit solvent model. So that's not to say that the charges are the same in all of these force field models. It means that the Leonard-Jones parameters are, there's a sort of cancellation of errors, and the Leonard-Jones parameters are making up for any changes in the charge model. Fortunately, we can make changes that do improve the accuracy. If we look on the right-hand side, we've tested whether the use of these off-site charges make a difference, and indeed they do. You don't need to know what the difference between all these different runs were, but the one on the left did not use virtual sites, and all the four on the right did use these off-site charges. So we can improve the accuracy in those cases. So we can go to open force field, for example, and say, hey, virtual sites improve accuracy, put them in your force field model. There's been some desire in this session to move beyond Leonard-Jones parameters, and I 100% agree. Just as a test case, we picked out this particular non-bonded force field model from a year or two ago called the Double Exponential model. So this looks a bit strange, but the epsilon and the R min here have the same meaning as they do in the amber force field, but it has two extra parameters labeled alpha and beta here, where alpha can be tuned to tune the steepness of the repulsion close to the atom, and beta can be used to control the decay of the repulsion. Sorry, I've said repulsion twice there. One of those should be the attraction. So although it looks very different to the Leonard-Jones potential, actually with carefully chosen alpha and beta, you can make the curve look very similar to a Leonard-Jones potential, or by tuning the alpha and beta, you can make it more or less steep. And this is nice as well because it's a natural soft core potential, and it certainly doesn't blow up at R equals 0, for example. Using a plugin to the open force field infrastructure, we can work in this potential, and we could use all of that nice infrastructure that John mentioned to go away and fit a double exponential force field that covers as much chemical space as all of the Leonard-Jones potentials that the open force field is developing. So So we've done a complete refit of all of those alpha and beta and epsilon and our min parameters. At the moment, we're not getting these from quantum mechanics. This is purely fitting to experiment. But if we do that and we compare with the latest open force field for a range of liquid properties, the double exponential form improves the liquid properties in terms of pure densities, densities of mixtures, and enthalpy of mixing. But similar to my philosophy from before, we'd like to improve this. So we'd like to investigate whether we can get these double exponential parameters also using QM to MM mapping directly from QM. Right, so I promised some machine learning. So now we've got all of these QM to MM mapping protocols for going from QM electron densities into force field parameters, very similar to the, identical to the methods that John described earlier. We can use this Espeloma model to go from a chemical graph to a topology graph to a continuous atom embedding, and then train that using a neural network to get these quantum mechanical properties. So as John described it, we're looking for the electronegativities and the hardness parameters, which are then mapped using this equation into the charges on the atom. But we can use exactly the same methods to also train against the atomic volumes, which go into our QM to MM mapping protocols and can then be mapped onto the sigma and epsilon parameters. So a reminder that all of our mapping parameters here are trained using force balance to minimize the errors against condensed phase properties. So the condensed phase properties are sort of indirectly going into this model via the QM to MM mapping protocols. So we've had a first go at this. We've downloaded 50,000 molecules from QC archive with their wave functions. Those QM reference calculations were computed at the Hartree-Fock level with Psi4. And we've used our KubeKit to assign quantum mechanical charges and volumes to those 50,000 molecules using one of our KubeKit protocols. And then we've trained this graph convolutional neural network to predict them for any new molecule. So this is a molecule in our test set, for example. And you can see for all of these nitrogens, for all of these in all of these different environments, then the quantum mechanical charges on the right-hand side are sort of roughly agreeing with those predicted by the graph convolutional neural network. And overall, if we look at the accuracy of the charges, that comes out around 0.02 electrons. And we haven't really done any hyperparameter tuning here. We think we can drive this down to be very useful. So I've said that we can use this model to get not just charges, but we can use the graph network to also assign the Leonard-Jones parameters to the molecules. And that means we can produce entire non-bonded force fields for molecules, which are completely defined by the atom embeddings. So there are no atom types at all in these sets of force fields here. So we've done that for about 100 different molecules in a test set. And again, we've gone away and tested the accuracy using liquid properties. So on the left-hand side, we've got the experimental liquid densities and the calculated ones using the graph neural network force fields, and the same for enthalpy of vaporization on the right. And the accuracy at the moment is very similar to the current SAGE open force field, and that's with those quite big errors in our charge assignment at the moment. So I think we can drive these errors down, firstly by improving the learning of the neural network model, but also then improving our training data as well. And all of these force fields are compatible with the open force field infrastructure, so we can look at mixture properties, free energy benchmarks, everything you like. Okay, am I okay for time? A couple of minutes? Okay, yeah, well, 1 minute. Okay, thank you. So just very briefly, just building on what Gabor Chani was talking about this morning, we're also very interested in using these machine learning potentials for drug discovery. And in particular, we're using them, as John mentioned, in these hybrid ML-MM approaches. So actually, John's already described this, so I won't talk about this. But a couple of years ago now, we used the gap model that Gabor briefly mentioned to train a gap model for this small molecule here. And you can see the agreement is very good with the quantum mechanical energies. And we can insert these in a MM model to calculate the dynamics of small molecules bound to proteins. And we can also make sort of free energy type perturbations between gap and MM models to calculate free energy corrections. Although this was only 2 years ago, this field is accelerating massively. So there's so much work we want to do here. In particular, we're very keen on these atomic cluster expansion force fields and even the newer approaches too. And we're working on implementing these as a plugin to OpenMM so that we can use these newer models as well. Okay, so I'll skip that one. And yeah, just to say, we're very interested in continuing to use machine learning approaches for learning both force field parameters, including these beyond Leonard-Jones potential models for long-range interactions, and including these off-site charges to improve the electrostatics, or also entire potential energy surfaces. Oh, yeah, just to say, this advert is not out yet, but I work in the chemistry department at Newcastle University. We will very soon be advertising for a new lectureship in data-driven chemistry. So if your field of work is anything related to this conference, you will be eligible. So people looking for tenure positions, do contact me informally to register interest. So thanks in particular to Josh Horton and Chris Ringrose who did this work, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We already have a question.
So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned ACPT. So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned ACPT. So you use ACPT, right, to parameterize?
No.
So I missed that.
That was just an example of something more accurate than what we were aiming at.
I see. So you didn't actually use it to parameterize. Okay.
No, all of the quantum mechanical calculations that go into the QM to MM mapping are just standard DFT calculations.
Okay. Well, I still have a question. So you made the choice of partitioning your charges according to AIM, atoms in molecules. This is the first time I see that in a force field. I mean, one of the recurrent argument being that this kind of partitioning does not reproduce well the electrostatic potential, which traditionally, especially in the amber force field, has been used as the fingerprint of the molecule. So can you rationalize this choice?
Yes. Okay, so firstly, it depends very much on your choice of the AIM model. There are very many AIM models that do a very, very bad job at reproducing the electrostatic potential. But the methods like DDEC that I mentioned and MBIS do a pretty good job of reproducing that. Of course, if you compute the charges on a single conformation of a molecule, your ESP charges are always going to best fit the ESP, and DDEC is not too far behind here. However, these charges are not always the most transferable between different conformations. So if you compute your charges on one conformation and then look at a range of different conformations, then the two methods become much more similar. So you need to take into account the transferability of the charges as well, which is not always done. But we do use these virtual sites as well to improve things too.
One question right here.
Hi, so I actually had two separate questions. The first is when you are putting those virtual sites on, are there positioned, so obviously you fit the value of the charge that you shove on the virtual site. Is the position, both in terms of distance and in terms of orientation of that virtual site itself a fitted parameter, or do you pick, or how do you figure out where you put the virtuals?
Yes, good point. So yes, the charges and the positions of the virtual sites are fit to reproduce the quantum mechanical electrostatic potential. The second point here, which I skipped over, is that we do limit the search for where we put the virtual sites by maintaining the symmetry of the bonding environment. So easiest one to think of is for halogens, you only really need to look along the bond direction in the sigma hole position.
Okay, I have some more questions that I'll ask offline about that. Unrelated, so looking at your condensed phase properties, when you were talking later in your talk about more advanced potentials, I noticed that your densities, were off by a bit. Your delta H VAPs though, like, seemed really nice. I'm thinking about the plots that you had, like two plots next to each other, one with DH VAP, one with density.
Oh, that was Acellera, right? Yeah.
Oh, okay. That was it. Okay. I think I slightly lost like which force field that was, but I guess my main question still stands, which is, so this was done, I assume, with a classical MD and without a many body force field. And at least from our work, we know what those shifts approximately look like. Do you have any ability to staple on, even if it would be slow, either path molecular dynamics and or a simple MBD force field to see if that gets you the rest of the way? Because those numbers, especially on the DH VAP, seem pretty close and within like spitting distance of what those effects might actually give you.
Yeah, good question. I might need to think about that one, but yeah, we've got a lot of approximations still in this functional form. So yeah, there's definitely tuning I want to do. Yeah, in terms of adding those on post hoc or whatever, yeah, I'd have to think about whether that's available in OpenMM, open force field infrastructure and so forth, and whether we could do that. But yeah, I agree, it would be interesting.
Okay, I don't see any other question. I think people are anxious to go to the coffee break. Thank you, Danny, once again.